Thank you so much for joining us. My name's Naomi Martin. I'm an assistant business editor at the Boston Globe. It's so awesome to have you all here today. I am joined by these amazing psychologists here, Dr. Allie Baker, a child and adolescent psychiatrist and instructor in psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, and Dr. Meredith Elkins, co-program director at McLean Anxiety Mastery Program, McLean Hospital, and Harvard Medical School. So thank you both so much. So obviously, as we've heard all day today and all know from our own lives, working and parenting is super, super difficult. And I hope that this session can sort of touch on how we can all collectively, stay sane and try not to lose our shit. It is really, really hard on a daily basis, at least for me. One thing that I know the panel's titled Managing Kids' Mental Health, but both of our panelists here, and obviously they know a lot about anxiety and mental health, they both said that the key to kids' mental health really is in the parents' mental health and managing our own mental health too. So we're going to talk about both since they're so intertwined. All right, so I guess first of all, can you just take a minute to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about how you work with parents and kids' mental health? Do you guys have the mic?
Hi, everyone. My name's Allie Baker. So I'm a double board child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist. So I wear a few hats. I'm at MGH, where I sit in the Center for Women's Mental Health, and I work with women and families across the reproductive life cycle, so everything from premenstrual concerns, certainly around pregnancy planning with respect to reproductive safety of your psychiatric medication, support in the postpartum, and then also, as awesome Dr. Heather Hirsch just told us, during the menopausal transition, helping support women and families throughout that time. I also sit at the intersection of medical, psychiatric, schools, and family systems. So I often will treat through medication management or school observations, parent guidance, doing second opinion consultations, helping sometimes kids and their parents, both, because so many of our conditions have a heritable component. And I think I have the best job in the world because the work is so dynamic. And it does feel that, we were talking about this beforehand, that intervening and supporting women at the beginning of motherhood is a pleasure and a privilege and the most noble investment in a healthy society. So maternal well-being, if there's like one take-home, maternal well-being is the bedrock of a healthy society. So I'm so glad you all are here today.
Thanks, Allie. My name is Meredith Elkins. I'm a clinical psychologist, and my background is primarily in child and adolescent work. I specialize in anxiety disorders and mood disorders and OCD in kids. And so that was where all my graduate work was and my postdoctoral fellowship. But I think one of the really important things to note in the past at least 10 years, I think, is really where we've learned that the old model of like, my kid is struggling with anxiety or a mood disorder and I'm gonna plug them in with a therapist and they're gonna come out fixed is just woefully inadequate, because there is such a reflexive relationship between parent and child anxiety and mental health disorders. And that can feel overwhelming. It's like, oh my God, my kid is struggling and now I also have to take care of myself. Like, how am I going to do all the things? But I actually find that that is really a point of empowerment, because we have learned as a field that there are some really wonderful ways where parents can be in the driver's seat, and both by addressing their own mental health, but also engaging in evidence-based ways to intervene with their child's mental health, we can really impact so much change. And so increasingly my work blended from just doing the child work to having more and more interactions with and exposure to parents. And so I am the co-program director of the McLean Anxiety Mastery Program at McLean Hospital, and we are an intensive outpatient program that offers wraparound interdisciplinary services for kids with anxiety and OCD. And then I maintain a small private practice that's dedicated to treating women in the perinatal period and to addressing anxiety and grief in moms. And we have so many areas of overlap where I really feel for you guys, because I think we could talk for way more than 30 minutes. We're gonna try to rein it in. And then importantly, I am the mom of one very cool little human. So thank you all.
And I'll give my cool little humans a shout out too. I'm the very lucky mom of 3 cool little humans. I'm a lot older than her.
Yes, and I am obsessed with my 3-year-old, and I have another one coming in a month. So.
Yes, Naomi.
So by the way, I have tons of questions, obviously being a journalist, but if you guys have any questions for our speakers, feel free to put them in the, there's a QR code that you can scan, and then I'll see them on this iPad. Okay, so there's this cultural pressure that seems to always be whispering to us, like, you're not doing enough, whether through social media influencers or other voices. And this can lead to this feeling that we need to intensively parent our kids, wanting to set up, a million activities and curate every moment of the day. We have lots of words for this, like, tiger moms, helicopter parenting. Can you guys talk about how that affects both our and our kids' mental health?
I think this is such an important question, because increasingly in my work with kids and with families, I find it impossible to fully separate what's going on with an individual parent and family from the culture in which we're all swimming. And so there's been a lot in the media about these parenting styles that broadly fall under the umbrella of intensive parenting. So helicopter parenting, tiger moms, I think most recently gentle parenting is the thing that people have some really strong opinions about on either side. But to get on the same page, what is intensive parenting? So intensive parenting is a highly involved style of parenting that really says, as a parent, you must place the child at the center of your life and of your identity. And it involves tremendous time and effort and emotional and financial energy to raise your child as a moral imperative. And so this places just a tremendous amount of pressure on parents these days. And I think it highlights how much this influences all of us, that even if you're the parent who's like, I fundamentally reject this style of parenting, the fact that you have to reject it means that it is the yardstick against which we're all judging ourselves and feeling like others are judging us, right? And so this is an inherently anxiety-laden construct. And I think many of us would maybe be happy to sacrifice ourselves on the altar of gentle parenting if it meant that our kids were going to be set for life, right? Because we as parents are told that we are the primary architects of our child's future happiness and success. And this is something that has become more and more pressureful over time. Interestingly, the sort of cultural concept of intensive parenting emerged at a time when more and more women were working outside of the home. And so a lot of scholars have actually suggested that this is sort of a guilty reaction of working moms feeling like, okay, I'm not at home anymore, so now I have to do all the things whenever I am present with my kid. We know it's bad for mom's mental health. And again, we have some very involved dads these days, but by and large, the research still says that the buck stops with mom. Mothers are more likely to be influenced and impacted by this construct. And we know that it's bad news. So much so that the US Surgeon General recently indicated in his discussion about the declining well-being of US parents that this culture is one of the main reasons for the decline of parental well-being, alongside things like economic insecurity, right? So this is a huge deal. And we know that it's bad for parents, but it's not a slam dunk for kids either. In fact, we have data that shows that intensive parents, the outcomes of their kids are actually just as good as the outcomes of intermediately involved parents. So, all of that extra that you feel like you have to be doing as a working parent may not actually be helping your kids, and we have more and more data that it actually may be harming your kids, because this over-involvement has a dark side, right? It is eroding our kids' independence, their resiliency, and creating more anxiety and more depression.
I'll just add that I think the paradigm is a trap for all of us, because we already contend with our guilt about not being the primary presence in our children's day. And so it's very seductive that if you can do XYZ and tons of scheduling and intervening and just general acts of doing, it feels like a tangible way in which we are pouring love into our children. And yet, we do know that kids who have downtime, lots of independence, more autonomy, learn to problem solve earlier. They are typically more emotionally regulated, and they have more resilience. And so it's sort of a win-win. The kids do well. We can give ourselves a break and sort of reject this fantasy of like work-life balance and shoehorn in all the intensive parenting and really focus on work-life, what I like to call work-life sustainability, because resisting this cultural pressure that you so beautifully described to over-schedule or intensively parent is fundamentally not neglect, although sometimes we're made to feel that way, and yet it is actually trust. It's trust in ourselves, it's trust in our children, and the outcomes are favorable to suggest that kids do, to your point, just as well, if not better, when they have a lot more downtime.
So how do we go about building resilience? Like, what are some concrete actions that you'd recommend parents can take for different ages, maybe a couple different examples to build their resilience?
Sure, we can tag team this one. Okay. So there's a great study, I think, that you were referring to. It was sort of a scoping review of all the data looking at what is good for kids in terms of resilience and independence. And it was called Decline in Independent Activity as a Cause for a Decline in Pediatric Mental Well-Being. And so the idea is that when kids have more opportunity to be independent, struggle, figure it out on the fly, and then succeed, they are much more likely to build those resiliency skills. So some concrete examples I could take sort of preschool aged. So in the 2 to 5 crowd, that can be letting your child pick a snack, figure out their sort of what they want to wear to school. Let them play on the playground and let yourself relax. You can watch them stumble and even hurt themselves, because kids don't need to be safe as possible. They need to be as safe as necessary. So that just in your local park, like letting them play and tumble and not intervening is an opportunity for resiliency building in 2 to 5.
Absolutely. And I think that, think about what you did as a kid, maybe what your parents did as a kid. My wonderful sister-in-law is here, and we were reflecting on all of the stories that my in-laws share about how independent they were growing up, and we had similar experiences, and now it's like, oh my gosh, don't let your kid outside and out of your sight because, I don't know, the neighborhood squirrel might attack that. Like, what is it? What are there's just, kids are safer now than they've ever been. So thinking about like what is a developmentally appropriate thing that you could ask your kid to do. In the school age, can you send them into the grocery store and you say, I'm going in this direction. I want you to take this list of 5 things, and can you get the produce for me? And we're gonna meet here. Can you leave them in the car while you go take the mail into the post office? Can you have them walk with a friend to, a local park, and not track them using a GPS, right? So there are these things but at the core of this, right, is our own fear, right? Like, oh my God, all of the like cable news, milk carton kid terrors of our life that we worry about. But, so this is so much about parental distress tolerance in addition to child distress tolerance. And so I think we need to really remember that negative emotions are not dangerous, right? If your kid feels scared or sad or bored or angry, that's okay. And actually, we would much rather have them experience those emotions and with you and have you echo like, yeah, you feel really scared right now. That's okay. That makes sense. You will get through this, without being like, oh my gosh, my job as your intensive parent is to only curate positive emotional experiences and negate all the negative ones, because then they're not going to build resilience. So in addition to developing, implementing developmentally appropriate independence tasks for your kids, I think at the core, if you can remind yourself that negative emotions are not pathological, that they are normal. And if you can have this as your framework for interacting with your kid, then they internalize that as their own narrative. And I think that's really the core of resilience.
Yeah, I'll just add that I think if we could rebrand pediatric distress as like growth serum or fertilizer, it's actually an opportunity. And sometimes that feels like a little much for a parent who's coming and seeking consultation from us and in legitimate distress around their child's distress. So this is not meant to invalidate that experience. The reality is that these are incredible opportunities for your children to learn how to tolerate that distress. And a well cared for child is not a child who's never experienced a problem like that, but really it's a child who's learned through the trial and error of making mistakes and figuring it out that they can experience distress and disappointments, frustration, failure, and then move through it and move on. And ideally before we're sending them off to very expensive universities. So this is an opportunity to take it home and invite these moments of not intervening, and your kids are going to bring stuff home to you, and you can sit back and just think about it as like expensive growth serum or like lovely fertilizer, and then watch them bloom where they're planted.
So many of the families with whom we work will just echo, God, like I wish they almost like want permission to allow their kids to be in a comfortable level of discomfort. And so this is Allie and Meredith giving you permission to let your kid be pissed off, let your kid be, anxious, sad. This is not like that we can always within parenting think about optimizing outcomes by imagining an upside down U, where either too little involvement or too much involvement is bad for kids, and we're looking for something right in the middle. So we're not saying, neglect your children or deliberately poke the bear, but we are saying introduce a comfortable level of discomfort and know that that's okay, know that they can tolerate it and you can tolerate it. And I mean, I can sit up here and say this, but it is really hard. Like I have a little girl who has, the emotional sensitivity of her mother and the lung capacity of her father. And when she is really upset, even as somebody who does this work professionally, I really have to check myself before I intervene. So we're not saying that this is easy, but we're saying, our kids are worth it for us to be able to tolerate a little bit of this distress to build their resilience.
And like I feel like when we're working full time and then we have like such limited time with our kids, like I love this idea of like distress being, a little bit of distress being like a growth serum, but it's like sometimes you just want to like have a peaceful, night with your kids, and they're going crazy. So I guess, is setting limits on kids good for them, good for us, even if it's not very peaceful? And what other kinds of, is there any evidence based on that? Like, and also when is it okay to sort of give in to them, and say like, all right, this isn't worth a tantrum. Like, is there any guidance you can offer on that?
Sure. I mean, I'll just say that, trade-offs with absolutely everything. We do have a ton of evidence to say that limits are really good for kids. Boundaries create security, and so absolutely appropriate to embrace setting limits and observing limits. It's okay to want a quiet hour to yourself in the evening. And so I was really moved by our earlier speakers talking about create and cultivate your village, your community, find your partner, I believe is what the Attorney General told us to do if you don't have one. But truly, what does that mean? Like this fantasy that we can do this by ourselves, that if we're struggling or our kids are not enrolled in multiple activities across the week, or we have a dysregulated moment ourselves, that we're somehow failing our kids and failing as moms is just fiction. Because we are not meant to raise children alone and in silos, and modern life is really challenging in that respect. But by getting support from people in your community, your family system, is actually a gift to you and your children, because you will then have more by way of bandwidth to be available for that tough hour at the end of the day and be more effective in terms of helping your kids in that moment with distress.
I absolutely agree. And, just to put a fine point on it, behavior is modifiable, right? So I think about how, was it like Nora Roberts or someone like that who talked about juggling all the balls, and some of the balls are glass and you can't drop them, and some of them are plastic and they can be dropped. And so I think about sort of limit setting and, sort of parenting as like kind of acknowledging at what moment is this like a plastic ball that I can drop because I'm strung the hell out and I need a calm night and we're not going to get into this right now, versus this is a glass ball. This is when I need to lock in and stay the course with the expectation that I set for my kid, even though this is like an absolute goat rodeo right now. Like sometimes you just need to know when you can drop it and when you can't. But know that when you've dropped the ball, it can be modified, right? Behavior is modifiable. Repairs can be made with your kid. And I think so many of the women with whom we work, we talked about this before, will just experience so much guilt if they snap at their kids, if they lose it at their kid, and nobody wants to do that. But again, this myth that we're going to be these perfectly regulated, blissed out moms all the time, and that we're going to be traumatizing their kids and our kids and filling them with cortisol shocks if we're not. All the things that our Instagram feeds warn us are going to happen if we snap at our kids. That's not going to traumatize your kid. And frankly, I would much rather my kid knows that I can have a stern voice with them and not just always be saccharine than have them never experience that until a gym teacher yells at them when they're 8 and they crumple. So we want our kids to start to experience the realm of the whole spectrum of human emotion with us. And we need to model it, and then we can say, sorry, I shouldn't have said it like that. I'm going to try again, or I'm going to take some space if I need to do that.
Just on the topic of social media algorithms, and I do wonder, are there other messages that you feel are getting through to parents that you're seeing in your work that you feel are just wrong, or that are there is there an evidence base that is being ignored in social media that we should know about with certain parenting messages we're getting?
Well, I think this notion of perfection is wrong, false, fake news, fiction. And so if that's being fed to you through your algorithm, then you can know, because you heard it here, that is incorrect, and perfection is not possible. Our kids don't need, nor will they ever get, perfect anybody or anything. But from a working mother's perspective, the goal is being present and trying to be sane taking care of your relationship with your kids. So when you invest with your kids in terms of time, and it doesn't need to be a tremendous amount of time, I would say quality matters greatly, especially for those of us who are working outside of the home all day. When you get home, you can spend that quality time and take care of that relationship, and that pays dividends down the line. Including when, for example, you have snapped at someone, you can repair. So that's the goal. It's repair, not perfection.
Okay, sorry, I'm getting the 5-minute warning. So so many parents struggle with the issue of screen time and like whether or when to give kids a smartphone. Are devices like contributing to mental health issues, and like what are your thoughts on this? And then I'll also just add in, this audience person asked that they would love to hear your perspectives on supporting kids developing a healthy relationship with technology, especially with building resilience.
I think given your work in this, I would love to hear your
Okay,
thoughts.
sure. So I come with a very specific perspective, and I'll just say disclosure. So I am a volunteer board member for Wait Until 8th. And maybe you've heard of it. If you haven't, I encourage you to check it out, because I think for working parents, this is a phenomenal resource to find other families who don't want to give their kids a smartphone, a fully loaded, internet-enabled, app-filled, time-sucking, dopamine-dripping device that goes with them everywhere, including the bedroom, the classroom, the tea, summer camp. It's insane. You don't have to do it. So I got a little animated there, but what I will tell you is that you can delay the smartphone. And when you go to waituntil8th.org and enter your data, you will find other families who live in your area who've made a similar choice. That doesn't mean your kids cannot have a phone if they need to have pickups coordinated, or they take a long bus ride home, or there are other needs, medical needs, just not the smartphone. So the reality is tech is not neutral, and it's designed to hijack their attention, and their brains are still forming. So the longer you can delay the smartphone, the better. I've never met a family who regrets delaying. I think we encounter families every day in the clinical setting who regret giving it earlier than they'd like to because they felt the pressure to do so. And I'll let you answer any other questions or add your perspective.
I completely agree. And I think that, again, this is a bit of a reframe, because often families will ask, what should I say to my kid to communicate with them about how our decision is to delay a smartphone. And I think at the core of that question is, how do I make it so that my kid isn't mad at me that I don't want to give them a smartphone? And you can't. They're going to be mad. They're going to be upset. That's okay. You can handle it. But this is, again, where we need to be okay with tolerating some of our own distress, with saying no, with saying a phone and access to a smartphone in particular is a privilege and not a right, and that I, as your parent, believe that this is not good for you. And I often think back to the first time you took your child to get their vaccines, and the doctor sticks the needle in their chubby little thighs, and you're crying and they're crying. You're doing that because you know that you're doing something that's going to improve their health in the long term. You're willing to tolerate your own distress and their distress because of that. And yes, in so many ways, arguing with a petulant 13-year-old about this is even harder than seeing your little baby infant cry. But so this isn't easy, but I think given what we know about what early introduction of this technology is doing to our kids, and despite the wonderful work of the Attorney General and so many other people, we can't wait for the companies to do this. We hope that they'll help us, but we have to have confidence in saying, this is my decision. I say no. You're allowed to be mad about it. End of story.
And I'll just add that if you're feeling guilty or awful that you've already given your children a smartphone, it's not too late. You can course correct. You can also just add more limits. And if you don't know how to do that, there are people in your life who do. I would say social media is so tricky because there's so much toxic social media. So if there's a way to pare down and lighten this sort of intelligence of the smart device, that's a nice middle path. So there's no guilt or shame here today. We didn't know. We're learning as we go. And so you can reference this talk as the reason why you'd like to now change the device or add limits when there once upon a time were no limits, why the devices will now be charged in the kitchen and not in your bedroom, why everybody needs an hour, ideally, of no screens before bedtime, why we're going to get an alarm clock instead of a phone, read long-form books, and so on. So appreciate you spotlighting that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This was such a wonderful talk. And thank you all.